Hello and welcome from us, where this week we're focusing on the European elections. And so with us are 5 candidates standing in the capital this time. Baroness Sarah Ludford is here for the Liberal Democrats. For the Conservatives, Dr Syed Kamal. Mary Honeyball is here for Labour. Jean Lambert is here for the Greens. And finally, Gerard Batten is here representing UKIP. Welcome to you all, and we'll hear from you all in a moment. After this, from Andrew Cryan.
There's no election quite like it in the world. 400 million voters from 28 countries electing 751 MEPs. It makes the European Parliament the largest democratically elected chamber on earth. But this week, the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, called the election a sham, asking how many of us could name their MEP. Sunday Politics spent 90 minutes in Oxford Circus trying to find somebody who did.
I've no idea who my MEP is.
I'm not sure.
No, I actually don't know any.
No, I don't even know what an MEP is.
I don't think it's very relevant.
I think it's because it's boring, to be honest.
To be fair, I don't think Londoners are given enough information.
You can be bothered with your own elections for Parliament, but when it comes to Europe, you know, it's an unnecessary distraction.
In fact, Londoners don't have an MEP, they have 8. The capital is one giant constituency, and at the moment it's represented by 3 Conservative, 2 Labour, 1 Lib Dem, 1 Green and 1 UKIP. But what exactly do they do?
They govern all of the rules governing the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour. So the regulation of financial services for the City of London, regulations on the free movement of people, all the people who come here from the rest of the EU to Britain, that's governed by EU law, which is amended by the European Parliament.
But with much of the population unsure about how the European elections work, or even what the European Parliament does, the job of parties to convince you why you should vote for them might be tougher than any other election.
None of you will be kind of, stranger to that sort of sense of cynicism by members of the public or the media indeed, but, how do you address it? And Syed Kamal, how helpful is it when the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, is saying that these elections are a sham?
Well, whatever people think of the EU, whether we like it or not, the European Parliament has equal power with the 28 governments of the EU. So when people are affected by European legislation, such as financial services or an environment or any issues where Europe initiates the laws, they do come to us.
What have you done to justify, if you had to pick out a single achievement that justifies you being re-elected?
I think one of the biggest achievements that we did as a Liberal group was to push the European budget towards cuts. We cut 30 billion off the long-term budget, and we focused it much more on things that would create jobs.
Gerard Batten, what do you feel is your biggest achievement of the last few years?
Can I come back to your original
Just answer
point?
that one first, if you can.
Well, I've been campaigning to get out of the European Union for 20 years, and my biggest achievement is to actually, with the aid of all my colleagues in UKIP, put that on the map, and the reason that we are doing so well at the moment, because that's what we argue. What I've actually spent the last 5 years concentrating on is actually opposing the kind of stuff that Sarah Ludford likes, which is the European arrest warrant, because that means that any British person now can be taken off to a foreign prison purely on the strength of a piece of paper, and a British court cannot protect them, and habeas corpus doesn't apply in European arrest warrant cases. And if I can come back to your original point...
I was going to ask you about that. A very quick answer on the Mayor of London. When the Conservative Mayor of London calls it all a sham, and in his newspaper column, what do you say to that?
Well, we don't want to be in the we won't want to be in Europe at all, in the European Union at all. But of course, the reason that Boris said this is he wants to replace it with delegates from the national parliament, and the reason he wants to do that is because they know what's going to happen when UKIP gets even more votes than MEPs than it did last time. Okay, so it was a self-interested policy that he was proposing.
Let's move on to a specific issue which everyone believes will be a quite major one, the question of immigration. And Mary Honeyball, when you address that, and you address maybe the question of Romanians, Bulgarians, the future couple of years, how hard is it going to be for you to win the voters' trust when people still kind of remember, don't they, or think that we didn't get it right with those accession countries back in 2004-05?
Yes, voters do recognise that, and so do we. And Ed Miliband has said that we did make mistakes then, and we're totally owning up to that, and we will not make the same mistakes in the future. And that's very clear, and that's in our manifesto, the Labour Party manifesto for the European elections, which has just come out. It was issued yesterday. So we're clear on that.
And so late in the day you would agree with and you will support what the Conservatives are now doing in terms of, for instance, appearing to control access to benefits and so on?
We are saying that actually we will make sure that people can't claim unemployment benefit here until after 6 months, whereas it's 3 months at the moment. And we also don't think that child tax credits and child benefit should be paid to families abroad.
We've made it plain that the whole of the European population has a right to come to Britain if they want to, and a great many have.
No,
the other parties did not get this wrong. This is exactly what they intended, is exactly what the Labour Party intended. They're only worried about it now is because of the UKIP electoral threat. And all of my colleagues around here and all the parties that they represent are now in favour of Turkish, or they have been for a long time, Turkish entry to the European Union, which would give another 72 million people the right to come here. Our policy is that we're not against immigration, but it should be of a degree and criteria set by the British government, not to have an open borders country to 27 other open borders to 27
they're
other
saying
countries.
that side, Kamal, how do you answer that?
Look, Britain has a proud history on immigration. I think London has a proud history on immigration. We're an incredibly diverse country, but the issues we have to look at are the concerns that voters have, very real concerns. One, over numbers. 2, over benefits tourism, no matter how large or small, and 3, numbers. But what I find fascinating about what Gerard is saying is, Gerard, you can talk about this all the time, you can stick it on your posters, but you can't do a thing about it. You haven't got a single member of Parliament. There's absolutely nothing you can do to deliver the sort of change that we are seeking to deliver.
Well, you have to wait a little while, side, because we've been building a political party for 20 years, and we intend to have members of Parliament, and we intend to have an influence in the only Parliament that can
Nigel
take
Farage
us
bottled
out
it.
of the... No, he didn't.
Yeah.
No, he didn't.
Well, you know that you know you're incapable.
This is a long-term fight.
More incapable of getting a member of Parliament.
And your government, sorry, your party, which is in a coalition government, has no intention of doing anything about these things at all.
We've laid
it's
it out.
all hot
We've
air,
talked about reform.
and it's all
We've
false
talked about
promises because you are frightened of the UKIP electoral threat.
You can't deliver,
and you are going to
Gerard.
see that delivered on the 22nd of
Gerard,
May.
you can't deliver.
Well, then why have democracy? Why have other political parties? If no one can change anything because you have a divine right to be there, you Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, and no one else can do it, why bother having elections? We are in a process of winning seats in Westminster.
A quick word,
Gerard, you talk about changing something. You have criticised the European arrest warrant. I see failings in it, so I've worked to get a cross-party coalition in the European Parliament to call for reform. You were the only UKIP MEP who turned up, and you voted against.
Yes,
so
because
you've got
we
no
don't want
credibility
it.
on
We
the
want
issue.
it abolished and a proper international
extradition treaty. How would you have got Hussein Osman, one of the London would-be bombers, back
and what about
in 6
all the
weeks
people
from
that have been
Italy?
carted off to European prisons and kept in inhumane conditions on the strength of your piece of paper?
On that note, a quick pause in hostilities to ponder this fact, which May's poll could be the last time you ever get to vote in a European election. Could it? Andrew Cryan has this.
Britain, with her Commonwealth links, has also much to contribute to the universal nature of Europe's responsibilities.
Britain joined the European Economic Community, as it was known back then, in 1973. 2 years later, voters got a chance to say whether they wanted in or out in a referendum, and chose, overwhelmingly, to stay in. But the Europe which Britain voted to be part of would soon change. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, opening the way for Eastern Europe to eventually join the EU. And in 1992, Black Wednesday.
The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
Britain left the ERM and set itself on a different path to most other European member states, meaning in 1999, when the euro launched, Britain stayed out. And come the peak of the Eurozone crisis in 2012, David Cameron effectively vetoed new Europe-wide institutions aimed at solving the crisis. Then, the following year, he had this to say.
We will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice.
And should the Conservatives be true to their word and win the general election next year, the UK will once again vote on whether to leave, meaning come the next European elections in 2019, Britain may not be a member.
If we had a referendum and if in that referendum we voted to leave, this could well be the last elections, the European Parliament elections that we vote in.
When you ask voters, look, do you think we should be in or out of the European Union? It's quite close, typically around 45 to 55%. So 45 saying, look, let's stay in. 55 saying, let's get out.
What would London lose if we came out of the EU?
Well, I think London would lose a lot of the vibrancy and the diversity. It would lose a lot of the legislation which actually makes it something of a pleasant place to live, whether that's air quality, water quality, whatever. I think it also loses part of its role within the world.
What do you think London would gain from coming out of the EU?
It would gain what the rest of the country gains, which is we'd actually then control our own lawmaking processes. We'd get a tremendous boost to the economy by getting out of the EU.
How would we boost the economy?
Because we wouldn't be paying all of these billions in every year to the European Union membership. When we come out, the economy would get a boost by getting rid of a lot of EU regulations, by getting out the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy. My colleague, Professor Tim Condon, has calculated that the direct and indirect costs on the British economy from membership of the EU is about £170 billion per annum. So, and this idea that we can't exist outside of the EU is nonsense. I mean, I seem to recall that London has existed for a city for about 2,000 years, and yet we've only been in the EU for the last 40. I don't think we'd have a problem surviving.
It's a majority of small firms as well as big firms who want to stay in the EU.
No, they don't.
And if we were wanting to continue to trade with Europe, which we do, we would have to accept all the rules and regulations. We'd have to be like Norway.
As we've seen this kind of rise, it's a bit more of a political question, I suppose. UKIP, you know, everyone agrees, it's showing in the polls as doing well, that this squeezes ultimately the Greens, which has done very well in these polls in the past.
Well, I think it's squeezing every party. And I think that when we're looking towards the future of the European Union and what we want out of it, I think that the trade dimension of it, there are risks at the moment with the trade agreement with the United States. I mean, this is something where my party is very clear.
How worried are you by the progress they appear to have been making, UKIP?
Most people don't want the choice of in, out now. They want a choice to vote for reform.
Look, the European Union itself has said that there's going to be no renegotiation, there's going to be no reform. This is a very clear issue. Do you want Britain to be a region of the United States of Europe, which is fair enough if that's what you think, argue for it, or do you want Britain to be an independent, self-governing nation? The argument's now the same as they were 40 years ago about this, the democratic issue, and we could have a referendum now if Parliament passed a bill. We don't need to wait till 2017.
Just a very last word.
Reform, renegotiation, referendum, only Conservatives are offering that. Labour, Lib Dems won't, UKIP can't.
You can't offer
we'll
it because they
lose
won't
a
give
load
it
of
to
jobs if we pull out of the EU.
On that note, to you all, thank you
nonsense.
very much indeed for being here today.